There is a silence that does not belong to peace. It does not belong to safety or rest. It is the kind of silence that appears when reality itself pauses for a fraction of a second, as if even physics is waiting to see what stupid decision will be made next. Somewhere in that silence, an empire was already doomed, it just did not know the shape of its ending yet. The Vorkai Empire believed in certainty. They believed in conquest that had already been proven, in victories that had already been archived, in enemies that were only enemies because history had not yet corrected them. They stood tall in a galaxy that had never seriously challenged them. 6 systems had fallen cleanly. 11 worlds now answered their signals. Their fleets moved like disciplined inevitability, and their commanders spoke like failure was a myth invented by weaker minds. They looked like perfection to themselves. 7-foot forms, pale and symmetrical, 4 arms moving with practiced precision, 3 eyes that never missed alignment errors or tactical flaws. Their worlds had no predators, no real survival pressure, no reason to doubt that they were the natural conclusion of evolution. And that, more than anything else in the universe, is how civilizations make themselves fragile. Because they begin to believe the story they tell about themselves. Supreme Fleet Commander Draxus Vel stood aboard the Eternal Supremacy and watched the tactical display like a man observing a routine inspection. Nothing here had ever surprised him before, and he did not expect that to change today. His posture was perfect in the way military tradition demanded, his confidence even more so. When he spoke, it was not with emotion, but with certainty shaped into sound. Report. His second officer moved instantly, almost too quickly, as if hesitation itself was punishable. Pelik Tan had learned long ago that survival inside command structures depended not only on competence, but on timing. Pelik also carried something dangerous that most of the bridge crew did not. He had read everything. Every intelligence file. Every analysis. Every warning. Even the footnote that no one was supposed to take seriously because it was buried beneath other footnotes that said the same thing in slightly different panic. Do not engage humans. That was the summary. The deeper text was worse. But Pelik had also learned something else. In militaries like theirs, reading too much information was not always rewarded. The human outpost is within weapons range, Commander, Pelik said carefully. 312 individuals confirmed. Mostly scientists. Mineral survey operations. Light defensive systems only. 6 turret installations. Draxus almost smiled. Almost. 300, he repeated. And they call this a presence? Research station, sir, Pelik corrected. Not a military installation. Even better, Draxus said. Pelik hesitated. That hesitation lasted only half a second, but it was enough to carry all the weight of future regret. His sensors had already flagged something unusual in the surrounding asteroid field. A faint irregularity. A pattern that should not have existed. But he did not interrupt. The fleet moved in as if the outcome had already been written. 14 warships. 2 carriers. A support vessel. A formation designed not for uncertainty, but for demonstration. This was not war. This was punctuation. A statement placed at the end of a conversation that had never truly begun. On Pharaoh Station, nobody noticed any of this at first. Dr. Tara Ogan was elbow-deep in a geological core sample, muttering to herself in the way only scientists who have been awake too long can manage. Her world was not conquest or empire or doctrine. Her world was layers of rock, chemical signatures, slow discoveries that did not care who owned the system above them. When the first sensor ping arrived, she ignored it. It had been configured weeks ago to notify her of debris interference, and debris interference was constant enough to become background noise. When the second alert arrived, she paused only long enough to sip her coffee and consider whether the alarm system was being dramatic again. To us. Then she saw the fleet count. 14 warships. She stared for a long moment, then set her coffee down with careful precision. "We've got visitors," she said over the station intercom, tone unchanged. "Armed ones. Someone might want to look at this." There was no panic in her voice. Panic required uncertainty. She had not yet decided that uncertainty was necessary. Commander Bren Solis arrived in the command hub within moments, Not because he was rushed, but because he was already close. His expression did not change when he saw the tactical display. It simply adjusted, like a man revising a calculation he had already been half prepared for. "They're hailing us," communications reported. "Put it through," Bren said. The voice that arrived was formal, rehearsed, and satisfied with itself. "You are within Vorkai territorial claim space. Surrender your installation. Power down all systems. You have 3 minutes." A silence followed that was not fear. It was evaluation. Bren looked at the display again. 3 minutes, he repeated. "Yes, sir," communications confirmed. He nodded once. "Very well." But he did not power anything down. Instead, he opened a channel that was not listed in any standard registry. A channel that did not route to nearby systems or fleet commands or known allies. It reached outward, far beyond immediate space, towards something that had been waiting quietly for months inside an asteroid cluster that had never been considered important enough to inspect closely. He sent 11 words. "Pharaoh Station under threat. Authorization 7. Immediate response requested." Then he closed the channel. On the eternal supremacy, confidence remained intact. The humans were stalling. That was the conclusion. Fear always looked like delay to those who did not understand anything else. "Let them hope," Draxus said. "Hope makes obedience more efficient when it breaks." Pellic did not respond immediately. He was watching the asteroid field again. The irregularity had changed. Slightly. Not enough for most sensors to flag. Enough for him to feel uncomfortable in a way he could not justify. And then it arrived. Not with the elegance of fleet transition or the spectacle of jump space emergence. There was no announcement from physics that something large was entering reality. Instead, space simply became incorrect in one region of the display. Something had been there the entire time. It just stopped pretending. The vessel was not large in any conventional sense. It was large in the way continents are large. In the way planetary structures make ships look like insects that accidentally learned to fly. Its surface was scarred, layered, functional in a way that suggested it had never once been built for aesthetics, only survival. And it was not alone. 13 more appeared across the field. Then more. Systems flickered as sensor reality updated itself repeatedly, refusing to accept the scale of what it was seeing. 31 vessels. Pellic's voice went quiet. "Commander, I believe the footnote applies." Draxus did not answer immediately. For the first time in his career, something inside him had stopped categorizing what he was seeing as possible or impossible. Those categories had simply ceased to matter. A communication arrived before he could recover it. The voice was calm. Controlled. "Human. Vorkai Fleet, this is Captain Amara Cross of the United Earth Navy vessel Relentless. You are targeting a protected civilian installation. Stand down." There was no anger in her voice. No fear. Only procedure. Draxus made a decision. Fire. 14 ships obeyed instantly. Energy lanced across space, tearing toward the human formation with everything they had. It was not hesitation that drove them. It was certainty. If something looked impossible, it had to be overwhelmed. The Relentless did not evade. It absorbed. Some impacts scorched the hull. Some dissipated. Some simply vanished as if the ship had decided they were irrelevant. Then it responded. Not as a single act of retaliation. As a process. Systematic. Controlled. Surgical. One ship lost engines. Not destroyed. Disabled. Another lost weapons arrays. Another lost navigation control. The fleet began to unravel not through destruction, but through removal of capability. It was like watching a surgeon operate with infinite patience on something that did not realize it was already on the table. Draxus stood very still. Pellic spoke softly. "We are not winning." That was not a tactical observation. It was a realization. "Retreat," Draxus said. The word felt wrong leaving his mouth. But it was the only correct one left. And so the Vorkai fleet ran. What followed was not pursuit. The humans did not chase. They did not need to. They had already done what was required. Instead, they moved forward. Toward Vorkai Prime. Because retreat, as humanity had learned long before anyone else had entered space, was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of consequence. 31 human vessels now occupied orbit around a home world that had never expected to be visited in this way. They did not fire. They did not threaten. They simply existed in formation, patient and unmoving. Captain Amara Cross transmitted again. "We are not your enemies. We are your reminder." Inside the Vorkai governing halls, something broke that had nothing to do with ships or weapons. It was not military. It was political understanding collapsing under reality. Councils assembled. Debates occurred. Legal scholars were summoned. Every interpretation led to the same conclusion. There was no version of events where the Vorkai had leverage. The final response was written carefully. "We accept your conditions." And somewhere in that acceptance, a species learned something it had never been forced to learn before. That arrogance does not survive contact with patience that has teeth. On Faro Station, Terra returned to her work. The rocks did not care who had arrived or left. The universe did not rearrange itself for empires. Her coffee supply was gone, which she considered the only real tragedy of the day, and she filed a requisition for more with the calm efficiency of someone who had just watched history happen and decided it was not her department. Somewhere above her, fleets withdrew. Somewhere beyond that, civilizations recalculated themselves. And humanity, as it often did, simply finished the job it had been asked to do. Quietly. Completely. And without ever needing to raise its voice. The Vorkai home system did not feel like a battlefield at first. It felt like an intrusion into something that had always believed itself untouchable. 31 human vessels hung in orbit with a patience that was almost insulting in its simplicity. No aggressive maneuvers. No dramatic positioning. No warning shots. They were simply present, like a decision the universe had already finalized and refused to reconsider. Inside the Grand Hall of Imperial Governance, Grand Consul Varys Ol read the transmission again and again, as if repetition might introduce a different outcome. It did not. The words remained stable, unchanged, indifferent to authority. Conditions were listed. Consequences were defined. Time was given. And at the end of it all, a sentence that bothered him more than any threat ever could. "We are not your enemies. We are your reminder." That was not how conquerors spoke. That was how systems corrected behavior. Outside the hall, the Empire tried to maintain its posture. Officials spoke in controlled tones. Military advisors argued in structured language. Legal scholars debated interpretations as if interpretation could soften physics. But everyone in every room was looking at the same thing. 31 ships. Not moving. Not negotiating through presence. Not posturing. Waiting as if patience itself was a weapon that did not require activation. Varys had lived a long life built on avoiding irreversible moments. Trade disputes, territorial tensions, political collapses, all of them had always contained space for adjustment. This did not. This situation had no adjustment space left. He approved the response personally. There was no point delegating it. Delegation implied uncertainty, and uncertainty no longer existed in the equation. We accept all conditions. The message was simple, almost embarrassingly so. But simplicity was the only honest language left. He added a final clause without consulting anyone. A joint oversight mechanism for future military engagements involving civilian zones. Not because he was asked to, because he understood, in a way most of his predecessors never had to, that systems fail more often from repetition than from accident. When the transmission was sent, something in the hall shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way people stand when they realize the outcome has already moved past them and is now simply being recorded. Back in space, Captain Amara Cross received the confirmation with the same expression she had worn through most of the operation, calm efficiency bordering on boredom. She read it once. Then again. Then she nodded slightly, as if confirming that reality had followed procedure correctly. "It is acceptable," she said. Lieutenant Joran Vex leaned forward, studying the fleet readouts as human vessels began repositioning. "That's it?" he asked. "We just end it?" Amara Cross took a sip of coffee that had long since stopped being warm. We didn't start it, she said. We ended the part that required our attention. Joran frowned. We had them surrounded. We had them contained, she corrected. There is a difference. He looked unconvinced. We could have taken more. She did not respond immediately. When she did, it was quieter. More is not the point. Stability is the point. That answer did not satisfy him. Then what's the point of having this much power if we don't use it? Amara finally looked at him properly, not as a subordinate asking a tactical question, but as someone about to learn a rule that did not appear in manuals. Because power that is used without restraint becomes the thing that eventually has to be restrained, she said. And restraint is always more expensive than patience. She stood and adjusted her coat, already mentally transitioning out of combat posture. The Vorkai will rebuild, she continued. They will recover faster if they understand what happened than if they spend decades trying to misunderstand it. Joran hesitated. And if they don't understand? Amara's expression did not change. Then next time, it won't be a lesson. It will be closure. She stepped toward the exit. Begin withdrawal. Notify Faro Station all hostile activity has ceased. As she left the bridge, Joran remained staring at the silent formation of human ships slowly peeling away from orbit. He spoke again almost to himself. We just made an empire blink. Amara paused at the doorway. We just reminded it has eyelids. Far below, on Faro Station, life continued without interruption. Tara Ogan had stopped thinking about the fleet entirely. Her universe had narrowed back down to rock strata, mineral veins, and the quiet satisfaction of data that behaved correctly. The only disruption she acknowledged was logistical. Coffee supply depletion. She entered a requisition request with the same seriousness she would have used for a critical instrument failure. Priority high. Essential operational resource. Then she resumed her analysis. Because from her perspective, nothing about the rocks had changed just because the sky had briefly become politically interesting. And in a sense, she was correct. On a geological scale, empires were just weather. The withdrawal of human vessels was not a retreat in the way the Vorkai understood retreat. There was no urgency, no disorganization, no visible relief. The ships simply adjusted their position as if concluding a scheduled task, then left with the same controlled precision they had arrived with. It unsettled people more than aggression ever could. Because aggression at least confirmed emotion. This did not. On Vorkai Prime, silence had become a political resource. It was being consumed rapidly. In the Grand Hall, Grand Consul Varys Ol reviewed the aftermath reports again. Fleet losses. Structural damage. Economic projections that refused to stabilize because every model assumed a return to pre-conflict conditions that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. And beneath all of it, one fact refused to soften with time. The humans had not escalated. They had simply responded. Exactly. Proportionally. And then stopped only when the objective was achieved. That restraint was what made it unbearable to calculate against. Because it implied intent, not impulse. Military advisors argued over phrasing, over classifications, over whether this counted as war or enforcement or something entirely new that their vocabulary had not yet evolved to describe properly. Varys stopped them with a raised hand. This is not a debate about language, he said quietly. It is a debate about survival. No one spoke after that. Because survival does not require interpretation. It requires agreement. Far outside the hall, Pelik Tan stood in a debrief chamber aboard what remained of the fleet command structure. His posture was still formal, but something in him had changed during the engagement. Something subtle, like a belief that had been slightly repositioned and now refused to return to its original place. A junior officer asked him what had gone wrong. Pelik considered the question for a long time before answering. Nothing went wrong, he said. That is the problem. The officer frowned. We lost. Yes, Pelik agreed. Because we assumed the scale of consequences would match the scale of our intent. He paused, searching for the correct way to explain something that no longer fit inside conventional military reasoning. They do not operate that way, he continued. Their response is not emotional. It is procedural. That is what we failed to understand. The officer shook his head slightly. Procedural warfare? Pelik almost laughed but stopped himself. Procedural accountability. The difference, he realized, was everything. In space above Vorkai Prime, the human fleet maintained orbit for exactly as long as required to ensure compliance confirmation was complete. No longer. Not a second longer than necessary. When confirmation arrived, Captain Amara cross-reviewed it without expression. The system is stable, she said. Her crew did not cheer. There was no celebration protocol for this kind of operation. Victory, in this context, was defined as absence of continued correction. Lieutenant Joran Vex broke the silence anyway. So that's it, he said again. We just leave them like this? Amara did not look up from her console. We leave them with what they understand, she said, which is consequences that do not require repetition. Joran leaned back slowly. Feels incomplete. Amara finally glanced at him. That feeling is how you know it worked, she said. The Relentless began its final repositioning burn. On the edge of the system, Vorkai observers tracked the movement carefully, expecting deception, expecting delay tactics, expecting some final hidden escalation. Nothing came. The humans were simply gone. No pursuit. No occupation force. No exploitation wave. Only absence. And that absence was worse than occupation, because occupation could be resisted, and resistance could be organized around. Absence left no enemy to rally against. Only memory. Back on Faro Station, Tara Ogan completed her 6th hour of analysis without once referencing external events. Her focus remained absolute, almost sacred in its simplicity. The asteroid core sample revealed a mineral structure she had not cataloged before. Not rare in a political sense. Not valuable in a military sense. But scientifically, it was beautiful. She paused for a moment, adjusting the rotation of the sample in her gloved hands. Then she made a note. Unknown compound detected. Further sampling required. Outside her viewport, space remained calm. The battle had not left visible scars here. It never did. Violence at this scale preferred clean outcomes, tidy conclusions, and clean-up operations that did not interrupt scientific schedules. Her calm console chimed once. New supply request approved. Coffee, premium blend. She exhaled slowly, almost relieved. Finally, she said quietly. Because in the end, that was the only metric that still mattered to her. Not empires. Not fleets. Not lessons written in fear across entire civilizations. Just whether the next shift had enough coffee to get through it. On Vorkai Prime, the aftermath did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as paperwork. That was the first true shock. There were no invasions sweeping through streets. No cities burning under orbital fire. No occupation forces enforcing surrender at gunpoint. Instead, there were transmissions. Reports. Council summons. Legal appendices expanding faster than military briefings could keep up. And at the center of it all, the human conditions sat unchanged, as if carved into something more permanent than politics. Acknowledgement of territorial violation. Reparations itemized. Judicial review of command responsibility. And the final clause that no one could stop rereading. Establishment of a long-term non-aggression framework. Grand Consul Varys Ol had expected demands. What he had not expected was structure so precise it left no room for emotional interpretation. It was not punishment. It was correction. And corrections, by design, are meant to be implemented, not debated indefinitely. Inside the military command sector, Admiral Draxus Vel stood before a tactical display that no longer showed enemy positions, because there were no enemies left in range. Only memory markers. Only recorded engagement history. Only the uncomfortable reality that every assumption they had built their doctrine on had failed in a single encounter that had lasted less time than a standard fleet drill. Pelik Tan stood a short distance behind him, silent. Draxus finally spoke. Tell me again, he said, how many they lost. Pelik hesitated, then answered carefully. None that were unnecessary, sir. That was not the answer Draxus wanted, but it was the only accurate one. And ours? Material losses, Pelik said. Significant. Strategic capability reduced. Fleet cohesion compromised. Draxus exhaled slowly. Not numbers, he said. Meaning. Pellic understood the question then. We misjudged intent, he said. We treated deterrence as challenge. They treated our attack as a solved problem. Draxus turned slightly. And the difference? Pellic's voice lowered. They were right. That sentence did not feel like surrender. It felt like mathematics finally resolving itself after resistance stopped. In orbit, the last of the human vessels were already gone. No announcement accompanied their departure. No warning of return. No promise of future action. Just absence again. But this time, absence carried weight. Because everyone now understood what filled it. Capability, discipline, and restraint that had been deliberately chosen, not forced. On the Relentless, Captain Amara cross-reviewed the final system-wide report before transmitting it back to Earth Command. Lieutenant Joran Vex stood nearby, watching her as if expecting some final revelation that would explain how something so large could feel so controlled. He finally spoke. We had them completely outmatched, didn't we? Amara did not look up. We had superiority in local engagement terms, yes. Joran frowned. Then why didn't it feel like it? That question made her pause for the first time. Because superiority is not the same as control, she said. She closed the report and transmitted it. Control is knowing exactly how far you need to go, and stopping there without hesitation. Joran looked out at the empty space where the Vorkai fleet had once been. And if they hadn't surrendered? Amara's answer came without delay. Then we would have continued until there was nothing left that needed explaining. That was not a threat. It was accounting. Back on Vorkai Prime, the Grand Council session continued into its second day. Arguments had shifted from resistance to interpretation. From pride to feasibility. From what had happened to what could still be salvaged. And slowly, reluctantly, the conversation narrowed. Not because anyone agreed emotionally, but because reality does not require agreement to function. It only requires acknowledgement. Eventually, Varys stood before the chamber and made the only statement that mattered. We will comply fully. There was no applause. Compliance is not celebrated. It is stabilized. Outside the council chambers, citizens watched news feeds that could not decide whether to frame the situation as defeat, negotiation, or survival strategy. The difference mattered less than the outcome. Life continued. On Pharaoh Station, nothing changed at all. Dr. Tara Ogan completed her shift report with the same precision she always had. The asteroid sample remained fascinating. The mineral composition suggested conditions that had not been catalogued in this region before, which meant more work, which meant more data, which meant purpose. She stretched slightly, rolled her shoulders, and glanced at the time. Coffee supply had been restored. That alone was enough to make the day feel properly aligned again. She submitted her findings. Then she saved the file. Outside her viewport, the system was quiet in the way only systems that have recently witnessed overwhelming force can be quiet. Not peaceful. Just aware. Somewhere far beyond visual range, civilizations adjusted treaties, rewrote doctrines, and quietly redefined what engagement meant in interstellar terms. And somewhere within those revisions, a single entry became standard across multiple fleets. Do not engage civilian installations under human protection. Not because it was illegal, but because it was expensive in ways no empire wanted to afford twice. On Vorkai Prime, the word peace was never officially used. It was replaced with a more precise term, compliance stabilization, because peace suggested emotional resolution. And nothing about the current situation felt emotional. It felt procedural. In the Grand Hall, Grand Consul Varys Ol oversaw the first full implementation meeting of the human conditions. Every clause had become a department responsibility. Every requirement had become an administrative chain. The military officers were not present as decision-makers anymore. They were present as subjects of review. And they accepted that silently, because resistance had already been tested once and the result was still orbiting their planet like an unblinking reminder. Pellic Tan stood at the edge of the chamber during one of the briefings. No longer speaking unless spoken to. no longer offering interpretations unless requested. He had moved beyond warning. Warning implied future change was still possible. Now he understood something else. Change had already happened. It just had paperwork attached to it. Later, in a private corridor, Draxus Vel stopped walking and stood still for a long time. Pellic waited beside him without speaking. Finally, Draxus asked a question he had avoided since the engagement. If we had fired first, knowing what we know now, would it have mattered? Pellic did not answer immediately. Then he said quietly. Draxus looked at him. We would have understood sooner. That answer was worse than defeat, because it implied inevitability. In orbit, human ships were gone, but their absence remained operationally active in every sensor log and strategic analysis update. Every fleet review now included a single reference line that no one removed because no one could agree on how to rewrite it. Human response threshold unknown. Assume maximum proportional escalation. That line alone changed doctrine. Not because it described humans accurately, but because it described what happened when you were wrong about them. On the Relentless, Captain Amara Cross submitted her final engagement summary to Earth Command. Lieutenant Joran Vex stood nearby again, but this time he did not ask questions immediately. He waited until the transmission was confirmed. Then he spoke. Do you think they'll try again? Amara considered the question carefully, as if it required calculation rather than opinion. Eventually, she answered. Joran frowned. Because understanding does not come instantly, she said. It comes after revision. She turned slightly toward the viewport. And revision requires repetition. That was not said with satisfaction. It was said like someone describing weather patterns. Predictable. Unavoidable. Not personal. Far below, Faro Station continued its quiet existence. Dr. Tara Ogan filed another report, this one concerning a secondary mineral anomaly that might indicate previously unknown geological activity in the asteroid belt. She did not reference the fleet. She did not reference the Empire. She did not reference anything outside her field of work, because nothing outside her field of work had altered the rock. And rocks were the only witnesses she trusted completely. Her coffee arrived exactly on schedule. She accepted it with gratitude that bordered on ritual. In the wider galaxy, historians would later describe this event in many ways. A warning, a demonstration, a correction, a lesson. But in the moment itself, none of those words mattered. What mattered was simple. A species had revealed that it did not respond to strength the way others did. It responded to responsibility. And responsibility, once activated, does not seek victory. It seeks completion. On Vorkai Prime, the final report was delivered in silence. Not ceremonial silence. Not respectful silence. Administrative silence. The kind that exists when everyone in the room already understands that speaking again will not change the outcome, only delay acceptance of it. Grand Consul Varys Ol signed the last compliance document personally. Not because it required his authority, but because refusing to sign would have been meaningless in a way that even pride could no longer justify. Outside the Grand Hall, the Empire continued functioning. Ships were repaired. Supply chains were restored. Communications resumed. Cities did not fall. Economies did not collapse. And yet, something fundamental had shifted in every calculation that followed. Because for the first time in recorded Vorkai history, they had encountered a force that did not take territory, did not demand tribute for its own expansion, and did not convert victory into occupation. It converted it into rules. Rules that prevented repetition. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Pellic Tan stood aboard a recovering Fleet Command vessel during post-engagement review. His junior officers spoke in traditional language. We were overwhelmed. We were outmatched. We encountered unknown technological superiority. Pellic corrected them once. We encountered discipline that was not bound to escalation. They stopped speaking after that, because it did not fit doctrine. And anything that does not fit doctrine forces doctrine to admit it is incomplete. Draxus Vel no longer issued commands in the same tone. Something in him had adjusted permanently, like a system recalibrating after exposure to a force it had not been designed to withstand. He spent long moments staring at fleet projections that no longer represented enemies, but probabilities of future misunderstanding. Because that was now the only category that mattered. Misunderstanding. In orbit, human presence had already become legend faster than it had become memory. There were no monuments. No claims of conquest. No declarations of dominance. Only a short classified report that circulated through military channels across multiple species, always ending with the same instruction. Do not escalate against human protected assets without full system authorization. Not because humans demanded obedience, but because systems that ignored that instruction did not survive long enough to revise it twice. On the Relentless, Captain Amara Cross stood alone on the bridge after all reports had been filed. Lieutenant Joran Vex approached quietly, no longer with questions, but with something closer to reflection. "You were right," he said finally. Amara did not turn. "About what?" "About restraint," Joran said. "About stopping when it was enough." She considered that for a moment, then corrected him. "Not stopping when it is enough," she said. "Stopping when continuing stops serving purpose." Joran nodded slowly. "That sounds like the same thing." "It isn't," she replied. And for the first time, she looked slightly distant, as if remembering older conflicts than the one just concluded. "One is control," she said. "The other is limitation." The pause. "We only operate in control." Joran let that settle. Then asked the question that had been forming since the first engagement. "What happens if someone else doesn't learn?" Amara finally looked at him. "Then they meet the system again," she said. "Until they do." There was no anger in it. Only inevitability. Far below, Faro Station continued its work without interruption. Dr. Tara Ogan labeled a newly identified mineral vein with careful precision, noting isotopic irregularities that might require follow-up sampling. Her report did not mention anything unusual in the political or military environment. Because from her perspective, nothing relevant had changed. The asteroid belt still existed. The rocks still contained secrets. And coffee was still the most critical resource required for uninterrupted analysis. She paused briefly before submitting the file, checked her inventory, and noted with mild concern that supplies were now sufficient only for standard operations. She added a routine request. Increase allocation by 20%. Reason, anticipated workload stability. Then she submitted it. Above her, fleets had moved, empires had adjusted, and doctrines had rewritten themselves in real time to accommodate a new kind of threat. Not a conqueror, not a predator, but a responder. And in the long history of civilizations that learned lessons too late, this one would be remembered not for its destruction, but for how quietly it enforced understanding. On Vorkai Prime, there was a new word circulating through military and civilian channels alike. Uncertainty. It had not existed in official doctrine before. Vorkai strategy had always been built on clarity, known enemies, known capabilities, known escalation paths. Even when conflicts were dangerous, they were at least legible. The human encounter had removed that comfort entirely, because nothing about it had followed expected structure. The Grand Council met again, but this time the discussion was not about compliance or repair schedules. It was about future assumptions. The kind that sit beneath every military plan without ever being written down. Grand Consul Varys Ol listened for a long time before speaking. "We assumed they were like us," he said finally. No one corrected him. Because it was not a theory anymore. It was an admission. In the Fleet Command Sector, Pelik Tan reviewed reconstructed engagement data for the 10th time. Every simulation produced the same result. If escalation continued beyond initial contact, human response scaled not linearly, but decisively. Not emotionally, but structurally. Each action removed options rather than reacting to them. It was not that they fought harder. It was that they fought in a way designed to end the possibility of future fighting. That distinction kept him awake longer than any damage report. Draxus Vel had stopped attending some briefings. Not out of neglect. Out of recalibration. He had begun to understand that leadership in this new context was not about issuing orders faster than events unfolded. It was about recognizing when events were no longer negotiable. One evening he spoke to Pelik without formal preface. Do you think they feared us? Pellic considered the question carefully.
Oh, he said.
Draxus raised an eye slightly.
Then what?
Pellic answered honestly. They treated us like a system failure. That answer lingered longer than expected. Because system failures are not feared. They are corrected. And correction does not negotiate. It completes. In orbit of distant systems, human vessels were already gone, but their operational footprint remained embedded in every strategic recalculation across multiple species. Training programs were updated. Engagement protocols rewritten. Entire branches of doctrine quietly marked obsolete. And at the center of all revisions was a single repeated observation. Human response is not proportional to threat. It is proportional to responsibility. On the Relentless, Captain Amara Cross completed her final debrief with Earth Command. There was no celebration protocol. No debrief awards. No ceremonial acknowledgement of success. Only confirmation of objective completion. Lieutenant Joran Vex remained on the bridge after transmission ended. He had changed during the engagement, though he could not yet articulate how. Finally he spoke. "It still feels strange," she said. Amara did not look up from her console. "Which part?"
"All of it," he said.
"The way it ended. The way they just stopped existing in our space." She nodded slightly. "That is what happens when objectives are completed," she said. "Presence is no longer required." Joran frowned. "So we just erase ourselves from the situation?" Amara corrected him again. "We remove necessity," she said. The pause. Erasure implies absence of consequence. We ensure consequences remain without continued presence. Joran let out a slow breath. "That sounds like something people would be afraid of." Amara finally looked at him. "They usually are," she said. Then she returned to her console. Far below, on Pharaoh Station, Dr. Tara Ogan had no knowledge of any doctrinal changes, political realignments, or military reassessments happening above her world. Her attention remained fixed on data that behaved predictably under observation. A rare mineral vein had been confirmed. The isotopic signature suggested a formation process not previously documented in this region of space. That, to her, was far more significant than empires adjusting their understanding of fear. She saved the dataset, labeled it, and leaned back slightly in her chair. Then she checked her coffee status. Supply levels were stable. For the first time in several cycles, everything felt properly aligned again. Outside, space remained quiet. But it was no longer the kind of quiet that suggested safety. It was the kind that suggested awareness. Somewhere in that awareness, civilizations updated themselves again. Not because they wanted to, but because they now understood what it meant to be wrong in a universe where correction arrives without hesitation and leaves without ceremony.